So it's now my pleasure to introduce this afternoon's keynote speaker. I won't go into a long bio. You have the biographical information, but I will say he's coming to us from the University of Waterloo, my alma mater. And to clarify, this is the University of Waterloo in Ontario, Canada, not the hometown of a certain Minnesota member of Congress. So Whitney, please come on up.
Well, thanks, Martin, for the kind introduction. And really a privilege to be here to kick off what promises to be a very informative and exciting discussion this afternoon. So we're talking today about a region that Southern North Americans, as we might refer to ourselves right now, a region that we don't usually spend a lot of time pondering. Significant parts of our respective geographies as Canadians and Americans makes us Arctic countries, but that's really seldom front and center in our political or public discourse. So our most pressing of concerns, of course, lie to the west or to the east: collapsing European markets, rising Asian hegemons, dramatic changes in the Middle East. Even most Canadians, who Americans often see as a northern people, like to huddle along the 49th parallel close to all of you than living in our northern spaces. So why is it that decades after having been, the Arctic being wonderful coffee table conversation for a small handful of academics and intrepid explorers like Will Steger, that the Arctic has suddenly become front page news? Overnight, the far north is the canary in the mine shaft, according to Al Gore in An Inconvenient Truth, a symbol of the impending catastrophe of global climate change. Newspapers are filled with headlines, magazines filled with headlines, saying the Arctic is changing so fast, new transit routes are opening up, resources are becoming available, that the region faces this danger of spiraling into some sort of anarchy. And it's going to be the wild, wild west of the 21st century, without law, where might makes right and challenges sovereign rights, poses serious threats to us as Arctic states. And this rhetoric, I always explain to Canadian audiences, is problematic from several standpoints. It leads or feeds our garrison mentality. Right? Crisis encourages thinking in terms of short-term optics. In crisis, governments need to act decisively to reassure publics. It's not about sitting down and having a dialogue and coming up with a very coherent, conscious, cooperative, collaborative strategy for things. And also a focus on crisis and the need to act decisively because you're threatened all the time alters your orientation. We don't often think about the Arctic and the circumpolar world from the standpoint of the people who live in the region and have lived in the region for millennia, indigenous populations. And as a Canadian, it was great and fills me with pride when I go up north and the Inuit refer to themselves as Canadians first, first Canadians. So they very much see themselves part of this great project. But this doesn't mask the reality that Inuit and other northern peoples in both countries are facing significant challenges that Southern Canadians and Southern Americans tend not to recognize or ignore. And many of these relate to that global issue of climate change, which, as Will suggested, is already a reality in the north. It's not some future that's going to come. It's there, it's real, it's having significant impacts on lands and waters, flora and fauna, and on people. So what I want to build around today is some reflection on a basic framework. We academics love our matrices here. This one was generated by the Arctic Council, the Protection of the Arctic Marine Environment Working Group. And really, if we look here and we assume that we're interested in seeing the Arctic become more part of the global stage, we can sort of build this axis around governance, less governance to your left, more governance to the right, resource and trade. What does the future hold? Do we want to basically lock the Arctic as a polar preserve, a zone of conservation that will be sort of held out from the rest of normal processes of politics and economy? Do we envision a future where all this hoopla about the Arctic is going to tail off and we're not going to worry about governance and see very little demand for resources? Or are we looking at a future where there's not going to be a lot of strong, stable governance, but there's going to be increasing demand for resources, as Will alluded to, that's going to lead us into this Arctic race, where we've got competition and conflict that's going to drive the agenda? Or do we look towards a more positive, collaborative, cooperative future where we see increasing stability, partnership, and an exploitation of managing these resources in a sustainable and positive way? Well, a lot of my experience up north, which is, of course, nowhere near as extensive as Will's, maybe about 300 miles all told, clocked on skidoos for the most part. I've got to see quite a bit of the Canadian Arctic working with a group called the Canadian Rangers. But I'm not speaking here as a northerner by any stretch of the imagination. I live on a farm in southern Ontario. And what I want to do is sort of rise above the tundra, rise above the sea ice, and reflect on some of the larger historical trends that help to situate Canada and the United States in the broader Arctic theater. And then suggest some of the items on the bilateral agenda that intersect that other speakers are going to talk about this afternoon. So I'm going to talk about the Arctic and reflect on some of the ways that we've seen and continue to see the Arctic, and we continue to see one another. In Canada, yes, we refer back to the True North, Strong and Free in our national anthem. We see the US often as an ally and as a competitor. And we get all wrapped up when we start to fixate on issues like sovereignty and the Northwest Passage. We get our knickers in a knot when we worry that the Arctic is slipping away from us, but then we usually retreat back into some sort of quiet apathy when we realize that these crises are really figments of our imagination. In the United States, the Arctic tends not to be the stuff of big politics. I was down in Washington last fall, and everybody kept telling me, look, the US, you Canadians think we're the soaring eagle up there who's threatening you. We're like the snoring elephant. We're apathetic, we're reluctant, and we're really quite ignorant about the entire region. It's not in front and center to our identity like it is in Canada. So what does history suggest? Then do we see a future of bilateral friction or cooperation? I'm going to suggest there's going to be a bit of both. But there's a good case to be made for cooperation, that we have more issues that we're facing in common than the popular media, at least in Canada, would suggest, and that we stand to gain the most if we work together, continuing to do what we do at present and what we've done historically. So I'm a historian. I'm up here to sort of race through history in 20 minutes or so, and use this as a backdrop to launch into some of the issues that we're facing today, right? We often talk about the future and look at it. Some of you might have read Charles Emerson's book about the future history of the Arctic, where he sort of suggests history is irrelevant. The Arctic's changing. We should just be looking forward. In fact, a lot of the issues that we grappled with in understanding some of the tensions or concerns between our countries over the Arctic are very much a reflection of a long history that we should be aware of. And that history begins before the first Canadians or Americans set foot in the Arctic, unless we consider that Indigenous peoples are Canadians and Americans who've been here since millennia, crossing over the Bering Land Bridge, hundreds, thousands of years before the first European explorers, and really genius in their adaptations to very austere environments, which we should still find remarkable, and I certainly do. We sometimes fail to acknowledge as well that the explorers who, quote unquote, discovered the Arctic region for distant sovereigns were not first Canadians and Americans, but Russians and Brits and Scandinavians. And these European explorers, for all their bravado, were newcomers. They could go around planting flags for some distant sovereign. Reality was they had a lot to learn if they actually wanted to figure out how to live and thrive in this region like the Indigenous peoples. For our parts, Canada and the United States, we weren't eager inheritors of empire, right? The U.S. purchased Alaska from Russia in 1867, but it was certainly a politically controversial choice at the time. We've probably all referred back to elementary school and Seward's Folly and all of that sort of stuff. And the U.S. was quite apathetic for the next third of a century, sitting on its Arctic possession and doing very little. This is almost mirrored in Canada. We inherited our high Arctic from Britain in 1880. Britain really didn't know what it was transferring to us. We didn't really know what we were receiving, but some American mining interests said, we'd like to maybe open a mine up on Ellesmere Island. Britain said, we don't want to deal with it. Canada, take it over and you sort this thing out. We sorted it out. The Americans didn't develop their mine, and we sat on the Arctic and did very little for the next 20 years. What launched it onto our collective mindsets was really the lure of gold, the sparkle of gold. And the real excitement in the region was generated by the discoveries of gold in the Klondike, a gold rush that burned very brightly for a short time, drawing thousands and thousands of people up from places like San Francisco and Seattle and other American cities, including some Minnesotans. And people were seeking a quick fortune, of course. Like most gold rushes, it was very short-lived, but it also meant that boundary issues all of a sudden became very central to settle. What was the boundary between Canada and Alaska? Well, Canadians, British, American representatives sat down to settle it through an international joint commission. The U.S. had the better case. I have to admit, you probably would have won regardless, except Teddy Roosevelt's manipulations and Britain's quickness to acquiesce to the U.S. for reasons that had nothing to do with the Arctic, of course, fed a sense of anti-Americanism in Canada. So if you want to understand why Canadians are so bizarre in thinking that you Americans want to come and take us over, this is the sort of stuff somewhere deep in our psyche that's lingering behind the scenes. It feeds this impression that somehow the U.S., in its great manifest destiny, secretly wants to steal our North away from us. And as a result, we've never really got past this misconception that the U.S. covets our northern territories. History, as I'm going to show you, should teach us otherwise, but unfortunately it doesn't. Well, after the gold rush faded, the Arctic sort of slipped back into obscurity. There was some whaling for a short period of time. In Canada's case, the first legal assertions of authority up here, but neither the U.S. or Canada saw it of great strategic value. Its resources were locked in perpetual ice, it seemed. It was largely inaccessible. These frozen wastes, as Southern citizens imagine them, remain the preserve of the Inuit and other indigenous groups of the fur traders, explorers, bush pilots, intrepid scientists, and so on. Science is one of the themes we're going to look at. This is a large issue that looms back in history as well between our nations. We focus now on cooperation. Historically, it was also a cause of some friction. 1925, Canada stood firm when the U.S. sent a scientific expedition, including U.S. Navy representation, up to Ellesmere Island and thought they weren't subject to Canadian laws. Canada insisted indeed they were. Things were straightened out. The friction was overcome. Subsequent American expeditions, I think, have pretty much always applied for Canadian permits and observed all of Canadian regulations and laws. So this implied an American acceptance of our territory claims in the region. And by 1930, Canada should have felt comfortable that its title to the Arctic lands and islands was actually pretty secure. And North Americans could sit back in wonderful, splendid isolationism during the interwar years, of course, resting assured that we lived in a fireproof house, far from the flammable materials of Europe and Asia, and so on. The U.S. came and said, we promise you, Canada, no one will attack you without getting us involved. And Canada said, well, we can't promise that to the United States, but we promise that we will not allow anybody to attack the United States through us. All right, we're getting along here just great. All of a sudden, this is going to be tested in the Second World War, of course. An inferno, the Pacific War, that really thrust the Arctic into the spotlight like never before. Canadians still considered the Arctic to be sort of a natural defensive barrier. But the United States was concerned, right? This was proven with the invasion, the Japanese invasion taking over of Attu and Kiska, islands in the Aleutian chain. Geographically, Canada's caught in between. The Americans came knocking and said, look, we need to be able to be sure that we can get up to Alaska. Your country's stuck in between. We need an Alaska highway. We want a pipeline to make sure we have a secure oil supply, energy security type stuff. We need airfields. Canada said, that's great. We don't have the resources. We're fighting this war in Europe. You're sitting out still pretty much for the last few years. You know, realistically, you want to do this, you're going to have to come up and do it yourselves. So the U.S. rolled into the region. Well, for our Canadian Prime Minister, who was very paranoid, he said, my God, this shows American grand designs. They're seeking to come in and take over the North. They're going to treat us, you know, an unfortunate quote, like we're a docile band of Aborigines. They want to get their fingers over all the Western Hemisphere. Well, history proves otherwise. At the end of the war, the U.S. said, look, we're coming up. This is tentative. At the end of the war, the U.S. left, as it said. Canada purchased the infrastructure the Americans had invested in actually building. We had secure title. We should have come out of the war with a reassurance that the U.S. was not seeking to take over our Arctic. But that's not necessarily what we came away with it from. And partly it was because of the quick onset of the Cold War. And all of a sudden, the geostrategic equation is shifted. All of a sudden, now the Arctic is the central theater or central space, not a place yet, but a space through which Russian bombers are going to come over and invade the North American heartland. The U.S., of course, had to assure that this didn't happen. Canada realized it was in it with continental defense, whether we liked it or not. And we did like the fact the Americans gave us that protective umbrella. So we realized we needed to sit down and talk with the Americans when they came asking for airfields. And this eventually culminated with the distant early warning line along the 70th parallel. A triumph of geographical engineering, planned and sequenced in the minutest of details, planned from places like MIT and Western Electric Corporation headquarters in Paramus, New Jersey, and then literally transplanted up to the north to detect Soviet bombers flying over the pole. It was a cooperative effort. What that meant was the U.S. paid for the whole thing. Canada industry got to benefit from doing a lot of the construction work. And at the end of the day, the Americans reassured us that our sovereignty was indeed our sovereignty, that the title to these stations that they built remained with Canada. So there wasn't a negative sovereignty impact, even though that's what a lot of journalists and politicians talked about in Canada. The most profound impacts were on an environmental and a social level. Indeed, little thought was given to the Inuit and other northern peoples when planning this sort of mega project. And it reveals the problems of designing things from afar and merely transplanting them into the Arctic. And what it meant on a political level locally for people who'd lived out on the land and traveled, who are all of a sudden now being pulled into settlements around these stations, disruptions. The unskilled 18-year-old zoot suitor Inuk, who's hired by the Dew Line, is making 8 times as much as the most skilled trapper who'd been revered for what he did locally. This threw into disruption in the region. So when people talk now in the north about the perfect storm that's coming, that the onset of all of this activity in the 2010s or 2020s is going to radically revolutionize and change the north irreversibly. We're 50 years too late. It already happened. It happened in the form of boxes being dropped out of USAF or Canadian Air Force cargo transport planes flying over top to build a lot of this stuff. And we're still dealing with the environmental legacies of contaminants affecting local ecosystems today. Well, everything sort of mellowed on the sovereignty front until the late 1960s and the discovery of oil and gas. And as, military strategic interests focused on satellites and submarines, the actual need to deploy systems in Arctic territory lessened. Instead, the focus now was on energy. Great news of an oil and gas field discovery at Prudhoe Bay on the north slope of Alaska, which prompted a renewed focus on the region as one that was ripe for resource development. Right? If you can tap into this 10 billion barrels of gas, the 26 trillion cubic feet of natural gas, how will you get resources to the energy-hungry eastern seaboard of the U.S.? There was no Alaska pipeline at the time. There's speculation. Why not use ice-strengthened ships like the Manhattan, an extra hull put on a vessel by a consortium around Humboldt Oil, to go and test whether you can sail through the Northwest Passage? The passage that the U.S. said constituted an international strait between Canada's Arctic islands. The U.S. isn't challenging Canada's ownership of the islands. It's saying this route or series of routes through the Canadian islands connects two bodies of high seas, which by definition in international law makes it a strait that anybody can pass through as long as they're doing it innocently and they're doing it uninterrupted and not stopping on Canadian shores. This is a right according to international law. Canada said, no. Look at this geography. This is clearly internal waters. We have control over these like it's the Great Lakes. Well, that's kind of confused. Let's say, like the U.S. has control over Lake Michigan. These are internal to us. And in essence, the U.S. came back and said, look, it's not that we really have a major issue with you over the Northwest Passage. We're testing the feasibility here. You're on side with this. The real issue is what sort of precedent this would set elsewhere. Because if we go and accede to Canada's position that these are internal waters, the same argument is going to be made in the Straits of Hormuz, Malacca Straits, and other strategic straits around the world. So Canadians continue to have this absolute neurosis that the U.S. is out to undermine us in the Northwest Passage. I would argue the issue is not really about the Northwest Passage. It's much more significant in terms of the precedent it will set internationally, and we'll revisit this one a bit. And Dr. Elliot Meisel, who's going to be speaking later, is one of the real experts on this particular topic. The Canadian discussion, though, was one that's familiar to us today. What happens if one of these ice-strengthened tankers breaks up in the Arctic? The impact on this environment, this pristine environment, will be devastating. Off the eastern seaboard of Canada around this time, in Nova Scotia, there'd been a tanker that had run aground and leaked some things. Scientists were saying if this happens in the Arctic, there's no way an ecosystem will rebound. And later this would be proven out, I would argue, with the Exxon Valdez disaster in 1989. So you've got your legal considerations. Canada's saying we have custodial responsibilities. And in that sense, we're going to go in advance of international law and set up a pollution prevention zone around our Arctic islands. And anything that happens within any ship traffic must adhere to our regulations. The U.S., Nixon, absolutely not. This is against international law. Canada said, look, international law is behind the times. Sometimes you need to step beyond it. Canada, the great multilateral player who loves to work through international bodies like the UN, stepping out and saying we need to push in advance because we're responsible now not for just a military space, but for a place where people actually live as well. And a place where the people living there were increasingly demanded that their rights be recognized. And resources are a great incentive for people to sit down and clarify ownership. If you're developing oil and gas on the North Slope, you want to make sure if you're going to build that pipeline that you have clear title to the land. Well, the Alaskan Native people who were never consulted in 1867 when the land title to Alaska flipped over said, okay, now it's time to sit down and you're not going to get away with this cheaply. So the U.S. in 1971 reached the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act, which was the largest land claim settlement in American history, extinguished Alaskan native title to the land in exchange for transferring title to 44 million acres to 12 regional corporations, as well just under $1 billion in cash to these corporations to manage. There's still some political conflict over issues of broader subsistence rights. But what I think this really did was also raised issues about internal sovereignties, if you will, within Alaska. And Canada was tied to this as well. Canadian native groups were watching all of this and suggesting that our land rights also can't be ignored when it comes to planning and when it comes to development. That if you're going to go and, say, build a Mackenzie Valley pipeline, before you do so, you've got to make sure that you are going and compensating us for our previous ownership. And when Justice Thomas Berger went up and met and spoke with Northerners in the mid-1970s, he heard from them. You Southerners think about us like we're some northern frontier, a resource frontier. We're also a northern homeland. People live here. Why should Southern corporations come up and get rich off our lands? Shouldn't we have a say in the future of our homelands? Shouldn't our worldviews be reflected in governance systems? Now, oil and gas did not take off, especially in the Canadian Arctic, as much as people had thought. But the last 4 decades have seen a dramatic transformation, reshaping of northern governance in Canada, first in the Northwest Territories and Yukon, and then eventually in Nunavut, the largest land claim settlement in Canadian history that led to the creation of a new territory in 1999. What this means is you've got very complicated jurisdictions in the North American Arctic. And we're going to hear about this in the sessions ahead. Native peoples are landowners, they're business owners, they're primary stakeholders in development, and they say if activities are going to take place in the Arctic, in their homelands, they have to benefit from it. And this represents both opportunities and constraints for governments and for the private sector. So what responsibility do the principles of sustainability and stewardship embedded in these agreements place on Canada and the US, as well as corporate stakeholders? And it's also important to remember that many of these indigenous groups actually straddle international lines that we went and drew historically, like, for example, the Gwich'in, whose caribou go and straddle the Alaska-Yukon border. Other border disputes that we sometimes hear about, like the Beaufort Sea dispute, which had never been settled, goes back to 1823, 1825, 1827, agreements reached between the Brits and the Russians at the time. Just a question of international law, whether or not the phrase jusqu'à la mer glaciale, up until the frozen sea, includes the actual ocean, or whether the boundary, as the US says, ends right at the shoreline on the Beaufort. We sat down in the 1970s to negotiate it because there was lots of concern over sovereignty and concerns about oil and gas and whether or not this was ripe for development. The negotiators sat down and said, really, this is not a pressing priority. Shelf this. We'll sort out the Gulf of Maine. That's a much more pushing issue for people in Maine and for New Brunswick. Let's focus elsewhere. It's been well managed ever since, but it'll come back up into our story in a little bit. The real irritant, the real friction point, renewing concerns about sovereignty in Canada came with the voyage of the U.S. Coast Guard icebreaker, the Polar Sea, in 1985. Not because the U.S. was out to do something dramatic and undermine our sovereignty, very practical reasons dealing with resupply for the Thule Air Base. And the U.S. said, our other icebreaker's broken down, it's in dry dock. Canada, can you go and send your Coast Guard up to do the resupply? Canada, no, our icebreakers aren't going. We don't have enough capacity. You'll have to do it yourselves. Service level, this is sort of flying under the radar. Then some political scientist in Canada jumps up and down and says, this could undermine Canada's control over the Northwest Passage. The U.S. are challenging us. What this does is leads Canada to be quite bold by our standards in clarifying and drawing straight baselines around our Arctic islands and now saying in international law, we are insisting that everything that goes on within this occurs within sovereign Canadian territory. Well, the U.S. saw this as a violation of international law, said that, in fact, the straight baselines are excessive across some of these big sounds. You can't draw baselines around sounds that are a couple of 100 miles wide, for example. The U.S. sat down and said, okay, well, you want to talk about this? Ronald Reagan and Brian Mulroney, our respective leaders, were negotiating a free trade agreement. Brian Mulroney said, we'd like to reach this trade agreement with you. The reality is Canadians are worried about the sovereignty issue in the Northwest Passage. Ronald Reagan said, all right, to his advisors, make this happen. Get rid of the irritant. Make this go well because we've got much bigger fish to fry. Unfortunately, when it came up to the U.S. Navy and other State Department officials, they said this is a fundamental issue about international projection, power projection, commercial, military. We can't concede. But the U.S. said, these are issues of continental defense as well. And Canada has a vested interest in it. So when Canada sat down with the United States, we reached a 1988 bilateral agreement saying that when the U.S. uses Coast Guards in waters that Canada considers to be its own, precise legal language to leave some ambiguity, the U.S. will not ask permission from a legal standpoint to say that it's Canadian waters, but will do so out of courtesy, yada, yada. What does this mean? Once again, crisis in Canada, solved by sober-minded negotiators who sit down and reach some sort of accommodation. And this agreement to disagree is probably the most stable way of managing this ongoing issue of the Northwest Passage, even though it's not very comforting to most Canadians who want clarity and we winning unambiguously. My message to Canadian audiences is it's probably not going to happen that way. And why would we risk taking something to court that we could lose when, in fact, we're managing it very well with a good friend and a good neighbor? Well, the 1990s pushed a lot of these issues back to the fore, right? With the end of the Cold War, we could expand our definitions of security, move beyond simple legal articulations of sovereignty, and deal with bigger issues. And in many ways, the strategies on the part of Canada and to some extent the United States were diplomatic and human-centered. How do we deal with these big questions of science in the region and what's changing that's dramatically transforming the environment? What new formulas or formats or forums can we create to go and talk about these issues and share science and collaborate now that the Russians aren't clearly our enemy and that we share this space? This led to the creation of the AEPS in 1991, which eventually grew into the Arctic Council. Very innovative soft law body, really for its primordial purpose, bringing scientists looking at environmental and human issues in the Arctic together to share information, not binding, not dealing with military issues because they just lead to formulaic, stock diplomatic exchanges, something that's cooperative and collaborative, and also as permanent participants, so representatives of the northern indigenous communities sitting around the table, unlike most international groupings. So it seems in the 1990s we're heading towards this Arctic saga. There's some growing interest in the region, but everybody thinks it's going to be solved by sitting down and having dialogue and cooperation. So what the heck changed? What accounts for this broader international discussion suggesting that there's a polar race facing us? Well, the variable, of course, was climate change. And Will has already alluded to this, right? We're all familiar with the basic idea, the shrinking and thinning of the Arctic sea ice cover, projections of a warmer, even ice-free region. This hits the public radar in the early 2000s. A lot of it clarified by the Arctic Climate Impact Assessment in 2004. You can go through some of the things here. Arctic climate warming more rapidly than anywhere else on Earth. It has implications worldwide. Vegetation zones are shifting. This has impacts on animal species and coastal communities who are also going to face new pressures. It's going to mean there's going to be more access for marine transport. This is going to have impacts on infrastructure, horizontal, vertical grade infrastructure built on permafrost. Indigenous communities are going to be affected. Radiation levels are going to affect people, and it's going to influence multiple people and ecosystems. In Canada, this was all read into more transport routes, opening up of the Arctic, Northwest Passage. Our sovereignty is on thinning ice, according to commentators like Rob Hubert. That in fact, this should be seen as a source for us to be nervous. And we talked about foreign ships coming and flooding our passage. We do not possess the capabilities, the tools to be able to regulate them and stop them. Again, more about Canada's paranoid insecurity complex than it is about realities, but it feeds this sense. And compounding it is all of the international focus on resources, mentioned once again, that the Arctic is this last great untapped resource frontier. And this is what fed that international discussion about this race to gobble up all of this. Because there weren't, according to a lot of the popular journalists who didn't know much about the issues, any legal frameworks that applied. Because there was no treaty like there is in Antarctica, because they're fundamentally different areas. One is an international space reserved for science with no people living there permanently. The Arctic basin, for the most part, falls within the jurisdiction of nation states and is governed by things like the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. As the Senator mentioned, the U.S. should ratify. Of course it should. The stakes are very high. U.S. Geological Survey came down a few years ago and said 1/4 of the world's undiscovered oil and gas lies within the Arctic basin. And the mineral wealth of the region, from diamonds to nickel to zinc, is very well known. I mean, is this height more than substance? The word is it's undiscovered resources. Uncertainty feeds paranoia much more than clarity. When you're dealing with known resources, you can plan for them, you can do cost estimates, you can figure out whether it's feasible. When it's everything unknown, people get worked up. And it feeds a whole bunch of misguided notions about extended continental shelves and boundaries that really aren't being recast. It's simply the fact that they've never been set in the past because we haven't done the science to make our claims and because the U.S. won't ratify UNCLOS. Something we'll come back to again in subsequent discussions. But for journalists, of course, you don't want to focus on international law and stability. That doesn't sell newspapers. Instead, you're going to focus on friction points in the circumpolar world. And the issue of boundaries in Canada became a big one. Even though these are relatively modest areas, and the fact is we haven't done a lot historically in the region to begin with, Canadians became preoccupied with issues like our battle with the Danes who were invading, the Vikings are back, invading Hans Island. An insignificant hunk of rock in the middle of Nares Strait that when we drew the world's longest maritime boundary in the 1970s, we overlooked because we couldn't agree on this hunk of useless rock a few football fields in size. Canadians are setting this up like it's a test of our mettle and our sovereignty. Also, this resurrected the issue of the Beaufort. What about the resources in this particular region? as the Arctic is opening up, do we need to settle this right now before Canada and the US come to blows? Well, of course. This is also projecting into the future. There's a lot of questions, of course, in light of Deepwater Horizon and other things about whether or not we actually want to be exploiting offshore resources, a discussion we're going to have later on as well. The real push came in 2007, as Will said, when we saw the lowest sea ice extent on record provided by scientists. And then we had Artur Chilangarov, Russian explorer, very ultra-nationalist member of the Duma, jumping up and down, planting that little titanium flag at the bottom of the North Pole on the seabed and suggesting in the eyes of the international world that Russia was laying claim to Santa Claus in his workshop. Reality was, at the end of the day, this was more of a publicity stunt, but it did signal a rising awareness. And what we've heard from Russia are some really tough talk about the need to defend what is its, proper rights to control resources in the region, commitments to reinvest in its northern fleet and a whole host of military capabilities, a resumption of strategic bomber flights right up, never intruding into, but right up to North American airspace. All of this as shows of force. On the other hand, if we get beyond the tough rhetoric, we'll see that their positive messaging intended for the international audiences is actually almost exactly the same as Canada's. That the Arctic is an economic frontier upon which their future prosperity will depend, and that they're going to defend it if somebody tries to take it away. And this is the sort of message that certainly came out of Canada in the first articulations of its northern strategy, when Prime Minister Stephen Harper came out of the gates very much focusing on military capabilities that he was going to develop. If the government was to be believed, it was a matter of use it or lose it. An awful phrase, absolutely ridiculous, preposterous, suggesting that Canada was actually suggesting it might lose what rightfully belonged to it under international law. Nevertheless, the sort of pithy soundbite that connects with audiences, what it did was signal the shift away from the human security and diplomacy and environmental emphasis of the Liberal Party predecessors, and a focus now on resources and defense, standing up tough for Canada. And this was followed by military exercises designed to show Canada's military capabilities. No, that's not the entire Canadian forces captured in the shot. We have at least double that amount, I promise you. But it's interesting because the message being read by the international community may not have us being taken as seriously as we'd like to think that we're being taken. So what about the United States in all of this? It also announced NSPD 66 in 2009, which shows an increased interest in the Arctic region, as we heard. Everything's situated in light of recent developments, altered national policies on homeland security and defense, effects of climate change, ongoing work of the Arctic Council, and awareness of the region's resources. So this is a broad definition of a national security directive as well. References to boundary issues and scientific research and transportation and energy and environment. And it says the U.S. will work cooperatively in the Arctic, but also underlines the need that it will operate independently if it needs to. So once again, hedging its message here, and Secretary of State Clinton, of course, has said and confirmed that the Arctic is an area which the Obama administration will highlight as a source of international cooperation. All right, so why is this the message in Canada? Right? There's a message, there's a line in the National Security Directive saying that, in fact, the U.S. considers the Northwest Passage to be an international strait. This is the only passage in an otherwise completely aligned document with everything that Canada is saying that drew any press in Canada. And of course, this becomes the hoopla. This is reaffirming the U.S. is out to undermine us. It's out to get us. Should we read U.S. Arctic interest once again as a challenge to Canada? Hardly. When we look at continental defense, we've been in it together since the Second World War. It's been institutionalized through NORAD in the Canada-U.S. Civil Assistance Plan that was reached in June between our countries, in the relationship between Canada Command and NORAD and Northern Command, which we're going to hear about in a little bit. General Chekin will give us some updates on some of these dynamics. We're already cooperating in many spheres. Our Coast Guard's working, for example, on mapping the seabed in the Beaufort Sea, and we work very closely together, as I'm sure Commander Durley will touch on later for us. In terms of our northern strategy, our messaging has also been much more benign. Yes, we face some minor disputes with our Arctic neighbors. These are things that we'll actually manage, continue to manage. These are not serious and don't inhibit cooperation in any significant particular way. This is the same message that came out in Canada's Arctic foreign policy. Much more sober, much more realistic, much more rational than the sort of pithy use it or lose it phrases that had come before. That, as the Consul General said, in fact, this is what we're looking for in the North. It's productive people, productive ecosystems, and as much cooperation as we can have. This is what all of the circumpolar states confirmed at the Ilulissat meeting in 2008 and in 2010 at a Chelsea summit, and saying that, in fact, we're going to have a stable, rules-based region, that there is an extensive legal framework that applies, so don't get caught up on the potential for conflict over these manageable boundary issues. Wait for the science to come in. We're already getting worked up about the potential losses of sovereign rights over seabeds beyond 200 nautical miles when we haven't even gone and submitted our data to make our national claims. It doesn't make any sense. In fact, we have many shared interests, and if you go through the National Security Directive, it shows here, this comes from the US document, it might as well be the Canadian one, because there's so much ground for us to collaborate as neighbors. What are some of these shared interests? Well, we can look at social indicators, a broad array of crippling realities in the North. Poor health indicators, housing shortages, chronic rates of alcohol and drug abuse, violent crime, unemployment, limited economic opportunities because there's not much economic diversity in the region, low education, which prevents people from working in skilled trades, taking over high-paying jobs. What are the responsibilities of governments and private industry in improving the quality of life? Sort of issues we're going to discuss in the Economic and Social Development panel. Of course, other pressing concerns related directly to climate change. What does permafrost degradation mean, not only in terms of releasing excessive amounts of methane and carbon dioxide into the atmosphere to accelerate processes, but what does it mean for infrastructure that we've built in the North or want to build, like pipelines? Coastal erosion, threatening communities in Alaska and also in parts of the Canadian Arctic. Flooding, like this image from Kwaluktuk in the central Arctic, things that had never been seen before in these communities. And questions about environmental security. As the tempo of marine traffic increase in the region, are we going to see the sort of disasters as have occurred in Antarctica in the last few years? How do we need to prepare for all of this? And if we do jump in with both feet and see the Arctic as a resource frontier that we want to develop in terms of exploiting oil and gas to help to bolster our energy security continentally, there are lots of risks associated with this. And we've seen it play out historically. And again, we can turn to Gulf of Mexico, putting that moratorium on development for the next few years. But what beyond? Well, improvements in safety and adaptation to climate change are going to partly come or mainly come through science, which is a priority in both Canada and the US. Lots of opportunity for collaboration and shared interests in this sphere, and the creation of a Canadian High Arctic Research Station announced for Cambridge Bay, something that Ms. Labonte has taken a leading role in shaping and will no doubt comment upon later, is an example of a new portal or platform for cooperative research before us. And the benefits of a collaborative continental vision, I think, are nowhere more central than in the field of transportation. In Canada, we've got a whole bunch of bold plans for the North. Rail networks, road networks, port facilities, better airfields. We tend to be very inward-looking. We look at this in terms of nation building within. What we really need to look at is how these plans fit into the strategic transportation network, which is inherently continental. And this is already well known in terms of pipelines. Fierce debates recently here in the US about a Trans-Canada pipeline initiative, right? North Dakota type stuff. Some of you know more about it than I do, for sure. The energy market is continentally integrated. So should discussions about what we're doing in the Arctic. There's also plans to enhance or develop new trade corridors, like those promoted leading up to the port of Churchill. This is where Minnesota very much comes into play here. It's attractive not just because this is an Arctic issue, but because it's an issue that's inherently integrative and presents opportunities for jobs and development in the heartland, and figuring out what that means, something we can discuss later. Obviously, I'm getting close to my time limit here. Water is same issue. We had a major strategic assessment come out in 2009 suggesting concerns about the Northwest Passage being viable in the next 10 to 20 years. Hogwash. We've got some time to sit down and figure out what we want for the region. Continentally, do we really want to encourage maritime traffic to use the Northwest Passage? If so, we've got to invest a lot of money into making it navigable, improving it, and setting up controls that we think are appropriate. Or in Canada's case, do we want to shut the world out of the Northwest Passage, then invest way more than we've ever contemplated before into defending it? And probably then, we'll still face challenges. If safety issues are the priority, however, which I think they are, then it's important to sit down, Canada and the US, collaborate, agree to disagree on some of the legal points, but realize it's the safety of the region that's at stake here most of all. So the future agenda, I think we really face a unique opportunity right now to craft a future agenda as Arctic nations, as friendly neighbors by cooperating and realizing there's great benefits in leveraging our respective resources, intellectual resources, scientific resources, economic resources, military resources, natural resources, in a region that's facing really rapid change. And it's this challenge and opportunity point, this equilibrium that we got to talk about. And we face opportunities because we both face a situation where we're going to take over the chair of the Arctic Council for Canada in 2013, the US a couple of years later. There's very little appetite in either country to expand the mandate of the Arctic Council. But that said, how do we use existing mechanisms or build new ones to go and hit on the themes of the panels that are coming up? International cooperation and diplomacy, economic and social development, environment, science, education. An environment that is tied to the rest of the world, it's a unique region, but it can't be extricated from global processes and the world at large. And it's going to come through science and education, the sort of exceptional work that the Will Steger Foundation encourages and a real innovator in. And the most basic component is educating our respective populations. Northern, Southern, Canadian, American, about challenges and opportunities. We need critical debate and reflection, which is why we're all here. And in the end, we can never lose sight of Northerners, the primary stakeholders in our North American slice of the circumpolar world, the people who are very much on the front lines of observing the changes in the region. And they like to remind us in southern Canada that sovereignty begins at home, that their views need to be front and center as well. And I'm sure all of our discussions are going to be mindful of this. Thanks, and I look forward to an afternoon of dialogue and discussion.